He saw his own face in the chemical bath 3 weeks before he died. Liverpool's Waterloo district, autumn of 1878. Thomas Hendley, 43 years old, operated a modest photographic studio at 47 Duke Street, specializing in post-mortem portraiture. He had practiced this profession for 17 years, long enough to be considered one of Liverpool's most skilled memorial photographers. His hands were steady, his manner respectful, his technical expertise beyond question. Thomas was a man of routine. A widower, father to 2 daughters, Elizabeth, 14, and Margaret, 11. He lived above his studio in rooms that smelled perpetually of collodion and silver nitrate. His wife, Anne, had died of consumption in 1874, and Thomas had photographed her himself, as was the custom. That portrait hung in his parlor, draped in black silk. He was known for his meticulous documentation. Every sitting was recorded in a leather-bound ledger. Date, time, subject's name, age, cause of death, length of exposure, peculiarities observed. This attention to detail was what made him respected in Liverpool's photographic community. And it is this same ledger that documented his final 3 weeks. On October 12, 1878, Thomas received a standard commission. The Ashworth family, residing in Everton, requested a post-mortem portrait of their elderly father, William Ashworth, aged 71, who had died peacefully in his sleep 2 days prior. Thomas accepted the commission, as he had accepted hundreds before it. Nothing about the sitting was unusual, but everything about the development was impossible. Thomas arrived at the Ashworth residence on Netherfield Road at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The deceased was prepared in the parlor, seated in a wingback chair, dressed in his Sunday clothes, a common arrangement for Victorian post-mortem photography. The family wished to remember William as he had been in life, dignified, upright, peaceful. Thomas's assistant, a young man named Peter Llewellyn, accompanied him. Peter had worked with Thomas for 3 years and had assisted in over 200 post-mortem sittings. He later testified that this sitting was entirely ordinary in every respect. The exposure took 28 seconds, slightly longer than typical due to the dim autumn light filtering through the parlor windows. Thomas counted silently, as was his practice, watching the plate through the entire exposure. William Ashworth sat motionless, as the dead do. The family waited in the adjacent room. When the exposure completed, Thomas carefully removed the wet collodion plate and secured it in his lightproof case. The sitting had taken less than an hour. Thomas accepted his fee, 12 shillings, and returned to Duke Street to develop the plate. It was approaching 4 o'clock when he entered his darkroom. Victorian darkrooms were lit by dim red safe lights, barely enough illumination to see by, but insufficient to expose the light-sensitive plates. Thomas's darkroom was in the basement of his building, a windowless room measuring 8 feet by 10, lined with shelves of chemical bottles and developing trays. Peter assisted with the development, as he always did. The process was methodical. First, the exposed plate was immersed in a developing solution of ferrous sulfate and acetic acid. The image would emerge gradually over the course of 2 to 3 minutes, first as a faint shadow, then with increasing clarity, until the full portrait resolved. Thomas lowered the Ashworth plate into the developing bath at 4:17 p.m. He noted the time in his ledger, as was his habit. Peter stood beside him, holding the safe light closer to the tray. The image began to appear, and Thomas stopped breathing. The portrait showed William Ashworth in his chair, exactly as photographed. The detail was sharp, the exposure correct, the composition professional. Everything was as it should be, except for one additional figure. Standing directly behind William Ashworth's chair, clearly visible in the developed plate, was Thomas Hendley himself. Not as he was at that moment, standing in his darkroom, alive, staring at the impossible image before him, but as a corpse. The figure wore Thomas's clothing, his dark wool coat, his white collar, his familiar boots. But the face was Thomas's face in death, eyes half open and clouded, skin waxy and discolored, mouth slightly parted, the unmistakable stillness of a post-mortem subject. The figure stood with hands clasped in front, in the exact pose Thomas used when positioning deceased subjects who were to be photographed standing. Peter saw it immediately. "Mr. Hendley," he whispered. That's you." Thomas said nothing. He lifted the plate from the bath with shaking hands and held it closer to the light. The detail was perfect. Every feature of the corpse face was his own. The slight scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the particular shape of his nose, the widow's peak of his hairline. Even his wedding ring was visible on the corpse's clasped hands. But Thomas had not been present in the Ashworth parlor during the exposure. He had stood behind the camera, as photographers do. He had not appeared in the frame at any point, and he was very much alive. Thomas's first thought was double exposure, a plate accidentally exposed twice, superimposing two separate images. But he checked his records. The plate had been freshly prepared that morning. It had never been used. His second thought was reflection. Perhaps some mirror or glass surface in the Ashworth parlor had captured his image inadvertently. But Peter reminded him. Thomas had stood far to the left of the subject, behind the camera. No mirror in that parlor could have reflected him into the position where the corpse figure stood, directly behind the subject's chair, facing forward. His third thought, which he did not speak aloud, was that he was losing his mind. "We rephotograph," Thomas said finally. "Tomorrow, we return to the Ashworths and photograph again. Fresh plate, different angle. This is a defect in the chemicals. It must be." But even as he said it, he did not believe it. That night, Thomas did something he had never done in 17 years of practice. He wrote to the Royal Photographic Society in London, describing what he had seen. He did not mention that the corpse in the photograph was himself, only that an unaccounted figure had appeared in a post-mortem portrait under circumstances that seemed to preclude any rational explanation. He sealed the letter but did not post it. He never would. The following day, October 13th, Thomas returned to the Ashworth residence. He told the family there had been a defect in the chemistry and requested permission to photograph William once more at no additional charge. The Ashworths agreed. This time, Thomas used a completely different plate, prepared fresh that morning with new chemicals from newly opened bottles. He changed the angle of the camera, positioning it 3 feet to the right of where it had been the previous day. He reduced the exposure time to 22 seconds. Peter witnessed the entire process. They returned to Duke Street and developed the second plate immediately. The corpse figure of Thomas Hendley appeared in exactly the same position, directly behind William Ashworth's chair. Same pose, same death face, same clothing. But this time, Thomas noticed something he had missed before. The corpse figure's eyes were looking directly at the camera, at him. Peter left the darkroom and did not return for the rest of that day. When Thomas's daughter Elizabeth brought him supper that evening, she found him sitting on the floor of the darkroom, both plates laid out before him, staring at his own dead face in duplicate. "Papa," she said, "what is that?" Thomas looked up at his 14-year-old daughter and said, very quietly, "I don't know." Thomas Hendley developed a severe headache on October 14th, 1878. It began behind his left eye and spread across his skull like a tightening vice. By evening, he was vomiting. By midnight, he was incoherent. Elizabeth summoned Dr. James Carrington, the family physician, who examined Thomas and diagnosed brain fever, a vague Victorian term for any number of neurological conditions. Dr. Carrington prescribed laudanum for the pain and bed rest. Thomas refused to rest. Over the following 2 weeks, as his condition worsened, Thomas destroyed both Ashworth plates. He smashed them personally, ground the glass to powder, and burned the fragments. He wrote to the Ashworth family, refunding their money and claiming the photographs had been irreparably damaged in processing. But he did not destroy his ledger. On October 28th, 15 days after the first Ashworth sitting, Thomas made his final entry. The figure persists. I see it now without the plates. Standing in corners, behind doors, in mirrors, always the same. My own face. Dead. I have tried to photograph myself, to compare, but I cannot bring myself to enter the frame. I know what the plate would show. October 28th, 1878. Thomas Hendley. If I am found dead, examine the darkroom. The answer is in the chemistry. It must be. The handwriting of this entry is barely legible, shaking, irregular, the letters malformed. Thomas Hendley died at 3:17 a.m. on November 2nd, 1878, 16 days after photographing William Ashworth. Elizabeth found him in his bed. Dr. Carrington was summoned and pronounced death due to cerebral hemorrhage, what we would now recognize as a massive stroke. Thomas was 43 years old. He had been in good health prior to October 12th. The headaches had begun suddenly and progressed rapidly. Dr. Carrington noted in his report that the speed of decline was unusual but not unprecedented in cases of sudden vascular catastrophe. The post-mortem examination, required by law in cases of unexpected death, revealed significant bleeding in Thomas's brain. The cause was listed officially as natural, but Peter Llewellyn, when giving his statement to the coroner, mentioned the photographs. He described what they had seen in the developed plates. Thomas's own corpse, appearing in an image where Thomas had not been present during exposure. The coroner, Mr. Edward Whitfield, made a note of this in his records but did not pursue it. Peter was questioned about his mental state and his potential use of alcohol or opiates. He denied both. The testimony was noted as assistant's account of unusual photographic artifact, likely due to chemical contamination or double exposure. The inquest concluded with a verdict of death by natural causes. Thomas Hendley was buried in Anfield Cemetery on November 5, 1878. 37 people attended his funeral. No photograph was taken. His daughters could not bring themselves to commission the service their father had provided for so many others. Peter Llewellyn attempted to continue operating the Duke Street studio but closed it within 3 months. He later told a colleague that he could not bear to enter the darkroom. He left Liverpool in 1879 and became a clerk in Manchester. He never worked in photography again. Elizabeth and Margaret Hendley were taken in by their maternal aunt in Chester. The contents of their father's studio were sold at auction in February 1879. Cameras, lenses, chemicals, frames, backdrops. Everything except the darkroom equipment, which was destroyed. Thomas's ledger was kept by Elizabeth. She preserved it carefully, though she never read the final entries. In 1923, when she was 59 years old and dying of heart disease, she donated it to the Liverpool Record Office with a note, "My father's professional diary. Please preserve. There are things in it that should be remembered." The ledger was catalogued and archived. Few people examined it. Until 1967. The ledger of Thomas Hendley remains in the Liverpool Record Office, stored in the Special Collections Division under reference number 928/1878. It is available for research by appointment, though few scholars have requested it. In 1967, a doctoral student named Martin Keyes was researching Victorian post-mortem photography for his dissertation. He discovered Thomas's ledger and read the final entries. Keyes became fascinated by the case and attempted to locate the Ashworth plates, but they had been destroyed, as Thomas's notes indicated. However, Keyes discovered something else. In the archives of the Royal Photographic Society in London, he found an unsent letter dated October 12, 1878. It had been donated to the Society in 1931 by an anonymous source, along with a collection of Victorian photographic equipment. The letter was signed by Thomas Hendley and described an unaccounted figure appearing in a post-mortem portrait under circumstances that preclude rational explanation. The letter had never been posted. How it came to be in the Society's archives remains unknown. Keyes published a paper on the case in 1969 titled The Hendley Phenomenon, a case study in Victorian photographic anomaly. The paper was largely ignored by mainstream academic journals, but gained attention in paranormal research circles. In 1983, a researcher named Patricia Hollis visited the Liverpool Record Office to examine the ledger personally. She reported that while reading the final entry, Thomas's description of seeing his own corpse, she experienced an overwhelming sensation of being watched. She left the archive room and did not return. The ledger was re-examined in 2003 as part of a digitization project. During the scanning process, the technician noted that the ink on the final page appeared to have unusual properties. It seemed darker in some light conditions and lighter in others, as if it were not fully stable. Chemical analysis revealed nothing abnormal. The effect was attributed to age-related degradation of period ink. The ledger remains accessible to researchers, but few choose to read the final entry aloud. Some photographs don't just capture the dead, they capture what comes after. Thomas Hendley saw his own death 3 weeks before it arrived. He tried to warn someone, anyone, but the words would not come. He tried to destroy the evidence, but the image remained, not on the plates, in his mind. Some photographers spend their lives documenting death, but what happens when death begins to document them? What you've heard was one photograph that should never have been developed. What comes next was a photograph that changed after development, month after month, for a year.